Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge, for at least for those of us in Australia, we are all on the traditional lands of First Nations peoples, and this land was never ceded. I today am at UTS. I've got a fake background, but I am actually at UTS. So I'm on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I want to pay particular respect to them as the nation of first contact, as the nation who resisted colonisation and invasion, and of the nation that continues to hold the knowledge about the land on which this university is built. So my name's Verity Firth. I'm the Pro Vice Chancellor of Social Justice and Inclusion here at UTS, and it's my real pleasure to be co-hosting today's event with the Human Rights Law Centre. We're joined by a great lineup of speakers: Alice Drury, Hannah Solomons, Liz Hudson, Neha Prakash, and Tennille Lamb. Actually, I don't know if Tennille is online. I think that was a little, she's unfortunately an apology. But anyway, everybody else will be discussing human rights and people with disability. I'll introduce you to each of our panellists properly in just a moment. In Australia, 1 in 6 people, or about 4.4 million people, have a disability. We have a Disability Discrimination Act, which aims as far as possible to eliminate discrimination against a person with disability in public life, and to ensure, as far as practicable, that persons with disabilities have the same rights to equality before the law as the rest of the community. While all our laws and policies affect people with disability, they are seldom designed with their varied needs at their core. Could a Charter of Human Rights be a better model for upholding the rights of people with disability? Human rights charters in our states and overseas have helped prevent human rights violations and provide a powerful tool for challenging injustices. I'm looking forward to hearing from each of today's panellists about how we can centre the human rights of people with disability in law and in policy. And it's my pleasure to welcome each of them here now, and I'll give you a little description of each of their expertise as I do so. Alice Drury is the Acting Legal Director of the Human Rights Law Centre. Alice works on systemic and emerging threats to Australian democracy, such as getting big money out of politics and putting an end to mass surveillance. Previously, Alice was the Legal Director of GetUp and has first-hand experience in responding to government interference with civil society, having defended the high-profile activist organisation at a time of significant government pressure. Welcome, Alice. Hannah Solomons is a PhD candidate at the UTS Faculty of Law with lived experience of disability. The focus of her research is how making disabled people the exception to the rule all the time affects the rule of law. She's also the head of Disability Pride Sydney, is passionate about the rights of disabled people, and considers the current state of affairs a human rights crisis on our doorstep. Welcome, Hannah. Liz Hudson is Policy and Research Manager from Children and Young People with Disability Australia. She has extensive experience with the disability, community service and mental health sectors. She completed her PhD at RMIT on the experiences of people with psychosocial disability during transition to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Welcome, Liz. And last but not least, Neha Prakash joined the National Ethnic Disability Alliance to lead a program focused on improving refugees and humanitarian entrance access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. She is currently the Director of Strategy and Partnerships at the National Ethnic Disability Alliance. Her previous work experience includes working as a settlement officer, leading legal literacy programs, and advocating for the rights of migrants and refugees. Welcome, Neha. Well, so to the questions. This one is to all of you. We have protections in the law. We know that we have that already, like the Disability Discrimination Act, that aim to assure equality. Are these protections working? And if not, what are some of the big challenges faced by people with disability? And we might start with you, Alice, as our co-host of the event today.
Sure, many thanks, Verity. So the Disability Discrimination Act is really centred around issues that individuals might have when they face discrimination on the basis of having a disability. So, for instance, it often comes up in the situation of employment, and you're really looking at situations where people are treated in less favourable terms. It's kind of the legalistic phrase for it. The difficulty with the Disability Discrimination Act, there are gaps, there are situations in which people are just not covered. So one example, for instance, is where an employer may not accept that an employee has a disability to begin with. And in such a situation, the courts have actually found, well, if you don't believe that somebody has a disability, you can't discriminate them on the basis of that disability. And it follows that they don't actually have a claim under the Disability Discrimination Act. So it's one example of the sorts of gaps that people experience under the current regime.
Liz, do you have issues around that you can raise?
Yes, thanks, Verity. And while the Disability Discrimination Act, operates across Australia and it's applicable in all states and territories, it really is failing to implement Australia's obligations under the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. And as SIDA, the Children and Young People with Disability, there is a representative organisation and advocates for children and young people with disability. We're really interested in the education sector, and Australia's education is, fragmented across states and territories, each operating their own system with different policies, practices and legislation. So, and in relation to education, neither the Disability Discrimination Act nor its subordinate legislation, the Disability Standards for Education, expressly mention a right to inclusive education as recognised under the Convention on the Rights of People with Disability. And we see this as a limitation, and the Disability Discrimination Act has really largely been ineffective to prevent that kind of widespread gatekeeping in our Australian education systems. There might be the formal or informal denial of access to or discouragement of students with disability attending mainstream schools. So that's our the biggest concern, I guess, is around the education. But we also believe that human rights protections for children and young people with disability are needed in many areas across education, employment, the justice system, out-of-home care, and the National Disability Insurance Scheme.
So it's an issue, presumably the Act just simply doesn't cover the scope of what people with disability are facing.
Exactly,
yeah.
Exactly, especially around inclusive education and the right to inclusive education.
Yeah, that's a good point. Neha.
Thank you, Verity. And just adding to Alice's point earlier, I think there are some gaps and loopholes in the Act, which doesn't cover everyone. For example, I think what NIDA always looks into mainly is the Disability Discrimination Act provides an exemption for certain provisions in the Migration Act and migration regulations. So people with disability and their families often run the risk of having their visas cancelled or applications refused because they are unable to meet the health requirement in the Act and the regulation. Now, Australia has very strict health requirements in law and in policy, and these are not consistent with equal protection and obligations under Article 5 and Article 8 of the United Nations Conventions of the Rights of Persons with Disability. So Article 5 being, which would look at equality and non-discrimination, and Article 18, which looks at liberty of movement and nationality. So this is something, there's a lot of gaps and loopholes in the Act, which even if it exists, if there's no mechanism to actually see it through, it's not the best. So yeah, thank you.
So Hannah, just coming to you, what do you think of the Disability Discrimination Act? Does it ensure equality? What are some of the challenges that people face who have disability?
No. That's the short answer to that. And I know, I was discussing this with my disabled colleagues, and there was a general reaction along the same lines. I'd actually go so far as to say that the law as it currently stands can actually have a obfuscatory effect, a deceptive effect, where you're in an advocacy situation and someone will say, well, we follow the requirements of the letter of the law, or you'll complain that something's going wrong systemically. And the response I've had from politicians will be, well, you know, it's illegal to discriminate against disabled people. And I'm like, yeah, I do actually. And what happens is when you pass a law, you create this illusion of legitimacy and that everything is as it should be, when actually bringing a claim under the Disability Discrimination Act is nigh impossible for your average person with a disability. Graham Innes, the Disability Discrimination Commissioner, had to like mortgage his house in order to get a $10,000 compensation payout from CityRay. So I would say, in short, no. End of story.
That's really interesting. Staying with you now, Hannah, I want to talk to you a bit about your research. So your research focuses on making people with disability the exception to the rule. The fact that we make them the exception to the rule all the time actually affects the rule of law. So can you share some of your key findings and talk us through your research?
Yeah, sure. So often the law will kind of frame this issue as something we can't handle. It's too difficult for the law to get involved in. So often when they make a law, they'll make a law assuming people don't have a disability and then put in little exceptions to try and deal with disability in the situation. And they do this in a number of different ways. But when you don't make a law that centers disability, what you end up with is the equivalent of kind of a grocery store that doesn't sell groceries, because disabled people are the people most likely to need the law. So what you find is the judiciary will often create an exception by excluding factors to do with disability from the decision-making process. So, or they'll draw incredibly sharp boundaries around what is a disability. And as soon as you do that, you can't actually access the exception for disability at all. So I'm working on a case, one of the cases that I've worked on is, in my research analysing, is a case where two disabled people were imprisoned automatically, basically, for non-payment of fines. And neither of them raised the fact that I had a disability. One of them was a person with mental health issues, locked in a cell, speaking to a legal aid lawyer for 5 minutes through a hole in the wall. And she went into a panic attack and decided not to raise disability because she was in a state of terror. So therefore, she was treated like everyone else, which is incredibly harsh. And it comes back to that advocacy effect, because they're like, oh, well, our system caters to people with disability because we have these provisions, but the provisions are impossible to access because the law likes to keep things nice and contained. And like one of the lawyers testified in this case that he has never had a person with intellectual disability raise to him that they have an intellectual disability. So like it's almost impossible. Another option is that the law will, there'll be these kind of discretionary, very broad discretionary exceptions that the judiciary or the ministry has to cater to people with disabilities. And what that essentially is a violation of the rule of law. So in one case called Marion's case, which is still the authority for a huge number of cases in Australia, despite the fact that it was a forced sterilisation case, the dissenting judge said to decide any case by reference to the formula of best interests, so that's it, you have discretion to do whatever is in the best interests, is not really a test at all. It allows lawyers and courts to persuade themselves and others that theirs is a principled approach to law. Meanwhile, they engage in what to others is clearly a form of ad hocery. So what Neha raised about what can actually happen is that you get deported for having a baby with a disability. And the government's answer to that would be you can appeal to the minister's discretion. And that is in a lot of situations. And a former human rights commissioner actually said that's a violation of like Magna Carta, like the original Bill of Rights, because it's literally the king can exile you on whim. So we're actually violating everything. The more what you see is that when the courts treat disability as just a normal variation on the law that is a factor to be considered, they tend to uphold these fundamental values in a very different way.
That's really interesting, Hannah. And Alice, I'm going to come to you because Hannah's raised some pretty stark examples of challenges faced by people with disability in Australia and particularly in the Australian courts. So do these, I mean, she's saying they breach Magna Carta. Do some of these examples go against the human rights principles and Australians' international commitments in terms of human rights treaties?
Yeah, they certainly do. So to bring it back to the experience of people who've migrated to Australia and have disabilities or have children with disabilities, as Hannah and Neha have raised, it's, you have a right under the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability to Equality and Non-Discrimination under Article 5. There's no carve-out in that article to say that there's an exception for, children of migrants or people who've recently arrived in Australia. Another example is what Liz was talking about in terms of right to equality of education under Article 24 of the Convention. There's no qualification there to say unless it's too hard for the school or they haven't gotten around to it. It actually imposes a much stronger positive obligation on states to take actions to allow children to be educated like everybody else and in an inclusive mainstream school. So all of these instances that have been raised thus far definitely conflict with Australia's obligations under the Convention.
So Neha, tell us, given that, tell us a bit about your experience with the National Ethnic Disability Alliance and your work with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, including obviously refugees and humanitarian entrants. What is required to ensure that their unique needs are considered in our policies and systems?
Yeah, thank you, Verity. So National Ethnic Disability Alliance is a cross-national disability peak body that supports and advocates for the rights of people with disability from migrant and refugee backgrounds. It is a disabled persons organization, which means a majority of our board members, as well as people, the staff, are people with disability from culture and linguistically diverse background, as well as so when we say systemic advocacy, we're looking at bringing about some attitudinal and some social changes to ensure that legislations, policies, practice, service delivery systems, all of this is inclusive and it meets needs of people with disability. Now, for them to be able to participate on an equal basis with others, there's a few things that first of all needs to be considered. One being you have to work in partnership with community organizations, with people with disability, with disabled people's organizations when you're co-designing or when you're designing or producing any service delivery design systems, policies, legal reforms, any research or evaluation that involves them and impacts them. Build capacity so they can advocate on grassroots level. And for any activism to happen, you have to be providing opportunities and platform so their voices can be heard. You have to make sure you include them in all formal and informal consultative as well as decision-making processes. Make sure that there's any barriers that can impact socioeconomic that can have a socioeconomic impact on on their rights in terms of on a systemic level, on a social level, on a community level, on an individual level is addressed. looking at exploring scalable options and solutions with people with disability, and also looking at what works, for whom, and in what context it works. Looking into some of these details, looking at disaggregated data around disability and culture and linguistically diverse people with a disability, because this always, you don't get this data enough, and it's really important to understand the current state of affairs and looking at where are the gaps and where are the pain points and kind of addressing them. Looking at simple and universal designs and solutions, this kind of benefits everyone and makes things simple, as well as like looking at, obviously people with disability are experts of their own lives as well as their needs. So include them in a meaningful way. Like engagement has to be done keeping in mind the United Nations Conventions of Rights of People with Disability, like some of the standards that they have set. And, often what happens is they're included in some part of the consultation, and then they just closed in terms of all the information that happens and everything that happens after. For example, they're like, okay, we want to hear about X, Y, and Z that we're planning to implement. And after they hear from them, there's no information about where that information is going, where that recommendation is going, how it's being used, whether it's been implemented, none of this. So it's really important to kind of close that information loop and keep them included from start to end. And one of the things that happens is like, they should really consider the negative impact of like monolingualism, which is just kind of producing resources and things in one language. So if people don't speak the official or the national language of a certain country, it's really important to look at what other options can we have. For example, like if there's just one language and people with disability have to rely either on another person, a professional, like their family member to access information, often their biases, the other person's biases may impact what information is being delivered. It may spread misinformation. So to avoid all of this, it is important to look at producing them in different formats. It can be easy read, it can be easy to understand formats, it can be in people's preferred languages. And it should not be an afterthought. All of this should be resourced for and thought through at the budgeting stage and while designing, and not look at, oh no, we only have like this much money left and translation is expensive. Well, it is an accessibility issue. So kind of looking at some of these things, and even making like small changes can be really transformative. For example, the NDIA provides like, say, translated information if you request them. If at the beginning of when an applicant says like their preferred language is the Arabic, for example, if they make it a rule that they would provide them with an English as well as an Arabic version, and for an option for people to opt out, then it's going to be like more used. So looking at like producing resources. I mean, I can go on, but like some of these things is something that should be considered. But thank you.
Thanks, Neha. That's really good. Liz, I'm just going to come across to you now because you mentioned it a bit in your opening remarks, but one of the big focuses of your organisation, Children and Young People with Disability Australia, is that you're working to create a more inclusive education system and equality for young people in public life. So can you tell us a bit about the work that your organisation does to meet these goals?
Yes, look, thank you. And I think before I begin, I'm wanting to provide some context, but also just to follow on a point that Neha raised before about inclusion, starting at the beginning. And that's something that people from the SIDA community, children and young people with disability, indicate is very important, that inclusion starts very early. So right at the early childhood education and care sector, from the beginning, and inclusion starts then. And to put that in context, that over 50 years of evidence tells us that inclusive education actually best prepares students with disability for life and success after they finish their education. But unfortunately, students with disability in Australia face so many challenges in accessing inclusive education. And as I mentioned earlier, and don't comply with the recognition under the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of People with Disability, but also the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. And so students with disability often face discrimination, segregation from their non-disabled peers, bullying, restrictive practices, suspensions and expulsions. And in fact, the research evidence suggests that school-age students with disability are segregated and suspended and expelled at higher rates than their peers. And then further, the highest level of educational attainment for people with disability remains lower than that for children and young people without disabilities. And so these inequities can have really long, lifelong implications. So, you know, we argue that a transformation in education is needed to ensure that Australia complies with the CPRD and the Conventions of the Right of the Child. And we know that inclusive education is essential for creating that sort of inclusivity. So we, through our work, would argue that all Australian children must be welcomed and supported at their local school and provided with high quality inclusive education. But sadly, for too many children and young people with disability, this is not the case, and that's evidence in our work. So some of our work involves, for example, we conduct annual surveys on education, and this year, for the very first time in 2023, we actually did a survey where we asked young people, students with disability, to report on their experiences in school. And we had 231 responses. Unfortunately, in our report on that survey, we've had to put a content warning around that the material in the responses were very grim around their first-hand experiences of violence that young people have experienced in schools. And you know, we had over 70% of our survey respondents actually experienced exclusion, and 65% experienced bullying. And not only did they tick the response to say they experienced bullying, but they were offered an opportunity to give free text responses. And we had nearly 100 respond to say to detail those experiences of bullying. And also some of these responses were to indicate actually that responses have been bullied. Many, they'd experienced that many times, and they didn't actually want to provide that detail because to recount the specifics would prove re-traumatizing. So it's alarming, grim, and therefore it doesn't uphold the rights of students with disability. Some other aspects of our work in particular is that SIDA is the Secretariat for the Australian Coalition for Inclusive Education, and that's a national coalition bringing together organisations that share a commitment to improving and advancing inclusive education in Australia and across state and territory education systems, including government and non-government schools. So, the Australian Coalition of Education have developed a national roadmap with some 5 sort of goals or pillars they want to achieve, and that includes things like calling for end of segregation, to eliminate restrictive practices which are occurring unfortunately at alarming rates as well, and to stop discrimination and bullying. So there's some of the ways. We also, in our work, we have had young people with disability be involved in co-designing their own policy papers around issues like inclusive education and human rights. And they ran a number of consultations in 2021, and that resulted in 5 policy papers co-designed, written and authored by young people with disability, calling for some of these issues. And we respond to government inquiries and submit policy papers and submissions to that, like the ones that we've done from young people with disability.
That's great, Liz. Now, a bit moving on, it's sort of a good segue from what Liz has been talking about in terms of segregation and education. I thought we might go to some of our audience questions. And the one that's got the most votes so far is Katia's question. And I'll read this out. And any of our panelists who want to take a go at answering it first, put your hands up while I read it out. Otherwise, I'll just come to you. So Katia makes the point that governments so far have been reluctant to address segregation on the basis of disability and to recognise this practice as a discriminatory practice and a breach of equality and non-discrimination principles under international human rights law applicable to Australia. However, ending segregation has been at the core of the struggle of disabled people. Ending segregation has been at the core of the struggle of disabled people for human rights. How can we progress disability reform to transition out of segregated models of support for disabled people? So who'd like to have a go at answering that first? Who has a view around that? All right, Liz first, and then I'll come to you, Hannah, then to Alice, and then to Neha. Liz.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. And thanks so much for the question, Katia. And yeah, I think that we can have this goal to end segregation, but we do have to have a phased approach to ensuring that the quality of inclusive education happens simultaneously as a plan to phase out segregated education, because it's no point closing schools that are not inclusive unless there's an alternative model that is quality education. So the Australian Coalition of Inclusive Education has actually a national roadmap developed for stepping through the ways that we can ensure a quality inclusive education system.
What do you think, Hannah? How can we progress out of segregated models of support?
I didn't put my hand up, but
oh, sorry. Well, it's okay. You don't have to answer it. Do you want me to move to Alice?
I mean, the general problem, I think, is lack of like designing. You need universal design in education, which is moving forward slowly as a concept. And that's generally how we need to approach everything, instead of seeing disability as a side problem and a fringe issue, which is still how we think. And that goes for every area of policy.
Thanks, Hannah. That's great. Alice.
I'll probably surprise no one on the call by saying I think a Charter of Human Rights is the key way, really, of moving forward to ensure that segregation is no longer the government's go-to, but in fact inclusion and taking positive steps in many instances to ensure that people with disability have exactly the same accessibility as able-bodied people. I'd give a shameless plug to the Charter of Human Rights.
And I might, Neha, when I come to you, we can talk a bit about transitioning out of segregation, but I might also ask your opinion about an Australian Charter of Human Rights, because the next question from the audience was exactly that. Is there a need for a federal Charter of Human Rights as a means of addressing these patchy legislation issues?
Oh, yes, 100%. That's a quick answer. But talking about inclusive education, that was something that was brought up in the recent Conference of State Parties on Conventions of Rights of People with Disability that was held in New York recently. A lot of countries speaking about the importance of inclusive education and how to bring about that transition. And they were looking at how there is a lack of research in this space, and in terms of as well as looking at best practice and looking at what needs to be done. And some of the conversations that were spoken kind of looked at how can you kind of also include this even in teachers training, kind of parents, and the whole education system, and everyone not working in silos but together, as well as looking at because I made a lot of notes when the conference was happening, but it was more around looking at that the shift has to be the shift when that happens has to take into consideration, relevant context, as well as it should be done in a relevant and appropriate manner, because good intention is amazing, but if it does not translate into meaningful inclusive solutions, there's no point. So it has to be done well, and it has to be done in an appropriate manner, is what was kind of like discussed a lot. But yes, did I answer everything? Sorry.
Yeah, no, that was
Okay,
good.
perfect.
And Alice,
Thank you.
since you were doing a shameless plug for a human rights charter, a charter of human rights, how do you feel it will make a difference to people with disability if we were to introduce a charter of human rights in Australia?
Yeah, so essentially the starting position for a charter is that the well-being and rights of people should be at the heart of every single decision that the government makes. And that's exactly what a Charter of Human Rights would do. And in particular with the participation duty, which is something that the Australian Human Rights Commission has put forward in the disability rights space. It's the, nothing about us without us mantra. And what that would do is put an obligation on government to ensure that there is deep consultation, meaningful consultation with people with disability regarding any government decisions that disproportionately impact people with disability. So that is just one of the key things that a charter would achieve, not to mention ensuring that people have recourse to action when their right to education, including inclusive education, isn't respected.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So one of the questions in the chat, I'll just see who it's from Belinda. She says that Queensland has a Human Rights Act now, and Section 36 contains a right for a child to access an education appropriate to their needs. She's interested in knowing whether there's a similar right in other jurisdictions, and has it been used to litigate successfully for inclusion of children at state schools. The emphasis on the wording in Section 36 is access and appropriate to their needs. Liz, you may know the answer to that question, do you? Oh, you're muted still.
I'm sorry, I don't have the details at hand and know what legislation is in the wording for each across all of the states. But I do know that there are some states where they have a Human Rights Charter or Act, and where children and students with disability have had their position or their situation assisted through having the charter or the act. But yes, I don't know what the actual wording is across similar. So I know that in Victoria there is the Human Rights Act, but in Queensland as well. So yes, it does, but I don't have that kind of detail at hand. Perhaps,
but essentially, yeah, Alice may know more, but I'll come to you in a second, Alice. But essentially, what you're saying is that having a Human Rights Act helps. Yeah. Alice, did you have any further detail on that question?
Yeah, just add, so the right to education also exists under the ACT Charter. And I'd recommend people check out the Charter of Human Rights website, which has got 101 different cases elucidated there. But I did just want to sort of mention one of them, which was in Victoria, a child with learning disability was threatened with expulsion by his school as a result of, what they deemed to be behavioural issues. The child's advocate was able to raise the student's right to education, and in that instance was actually successful in preventing the expulsion. So it's just sort of one example of the charter being used in an individual's case to ensure that, they weren't discriminated against in Victoria.
Yeah, okay, that's good. And Liz, you had something further to add?
Yes, we ourselves and another disability representative organisation and Australian Human Rights Law Rights Centre put in a joint policy submission to the Disability Royal Commission about the benefits of introducing a charter, and listed a series of all examples, case studies that Alice just mentioned before, about the successful application of the use of a human rights charter in those states. And so I just have a couple of other examples, but to what Alice said was that there was, a young woman in Victoria with who via the Human Rights Charter, was able to access disability services that were, and previously, she had been declined that, and a child with a disability was exempted from being in detention in hotel quarantine by the Queensland Human Resources Act due to the behavioural challenges of the child, so that they were actually, the child and the family did seek an exemption, and it was approved. So they're just a couple of examples of the many ways that a charter can assist.
Yeah, that's really good to practical case studies about how it can help. The next question from Dana, I think, is a good one too, actually, because it's saying, okay, what role can industry play in supporting and leading the way on policy for people with disability and their employees with disability? And I think that's a really important one. We always talk about government, and we always talk about government delivery of education and other services, but what about industry, and what about the corporate sector? Does anyone want to have a go at answering this first? Otherwise, I'm going to pick on you. Well, Neha, do you have any views about what role industry could play, particularly maybe in employment of people with disability?
I think similar to the government, I feel like it's everyone's responsibility, if you look at the social model of disability, to ensure you provide reasonable accommodation when necessary, listen to the needs and respond appropriately, ensure that you are, if there's any training required in terms of, providing those opportunities for people to progress higher, provide those opportunities, make sure there's representation, there's where, in high level positions as well, like you see on a lot of executive levels, even in the NDI, there should be people with disability involved. So yes, I think that's a starting point for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Neha. And Alice, what do you think for the role for industry?
Just yes, and what Neha was saying. So there is chronically high levels of, incredibly high levels of unemployment and underemployment of people with disability. And I think the first thing that industry can do is seek to address that. And I know organisations like Vision Australia are arguing for quotas, for instance, in the public service. And so, that's a conversation the industry could be having, whether they want to be thinking through quotas or other means that ensure that they're actually, doing the hard yards, putting their money where their mouth is and employing people who need employment.
Yeah. Liz?
I think also in industry, there's the existence at the moment of the Australian Disability Enterprises, which are segregated employment, and where there's some breaches of human rights with regard to payment of people with disability in those environments. And so, SIDA would argue that that we actively work toward the goal of ending segregation, not only in schools, but in housing and workplaces. So, so that whilst it's not corporate that I'm giving advice to, but if there is opportunity to include people with disability in employment that's not segregated and doesn't and they're not underpaid.
Hannah?
So I would like to second what Liz said. ADs are unacceptable. Just the mentality, for example, during COVID, the government pandemic plan didn't actually mention disability anywhere. And when they brought out the first announcement that they were going to help us, it was a bailout for ADEs. And they were kept open where they were like huge factories spreading. So underneath all of this is the general problem of segregation in our entire public policy. So disabled people are disability, if you take an interactional model of disability and you say that disability is an interaction between impairment and the society in which you live, which is fairly like, that is kind of what international human rights law uses, then you can no longer say that disabled people are a separate group, because the disability is performed by society. And I remember as part of my advocacy work, just creating this slideshow that says this is the first 10 minutes of a able-bodied person's life, which is they wake up on a mattress designed by experts and custom built. They use an assistive device to help them get up in the morning. The government provides electricity so that they can look at, so that they can see where they're going. And they're dependent on the city for water. And yet an employer looks at a disabled person and says, oh my goodness, you need extra help. Forget that I provide computers and ergonomic chairs. And the law requires these things already, so long as they're mainstream. So, but as soon as it's a disability, it's shuffled into a different area of law. And I think that's the interesting thing about the Bill of Rights debate, is that there are people who would point out that, you know, in America, despite having Bill of Rights, there was still forced sterilization of disabled women with the famous Supreme Court quote, 3 generations of idiots is enough. That was their highest court adjudicating on a Bill of Rights case. But what you seem to find in practice is that having a Bill of Rights focuses the judiciary on our humanity, because we have rights as human beings. And that is the huge difference, is that you're no longer looking at what the person has, the rights the person has as a disabled person. You're like, well, this person has a right to fair pay. What's fair pay? And that's the big difference, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Neha.
Thanks, Verity. Just adding to what Alice mentioned earlier, I think in terms of just hiring more people, one of the things would be to ensure that any future federally funded like employment services incorporate like, you know, specialist services as well as inclusion experts, because many of the consultants and employment services are not qualified or experienced in supporting people with a disability and understanding individual barriers to employment. So I think, as well as looking at providing, you know, having them to do ongoing training and professional development would be really good, as well as like holding them more accountable in terms of like getting that done through any federally funded ones. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Alice?
Thanks, Verity. I'd also sort of say, if we're thinking about industry, particular industries, I think we should be, you know, asking to the table and making sure that the rights of people with disability are at the centre of their decision making. The service providers of disability care and also aged care, and that's sort of what we've seen pretty clearly from both of the Royal Commissions, that that's not the case currently, and that's definitely one big ask that we would have of industry and service providers in those spaces.
And more generally, because I think that's really interesting about the big asks, coming back to the panel as a whole, what would you like to see in the way that we talk and think about disability in law and policy conversations? And I sort of mean that about all of us, about us as a culture, as a society. What would you like to see change? Liz, what about you first?
I think changing in the conversation is to go back to, you know, the theme that I've been representing today, is to have a change in the way that we use language to talk, and that is, so it's not just inclusive education, but inclusive language, and that we respect the rights of respect the experience of people with disability about what language they would like to use to be represented. So I think language changes, and then that flows on to cultural change, and a more inclusive society. So that does focus on the human rights. So that, I think it's just that language, and include, as Alice mentioned before, the nothing about us without us, or also reframe to nothing without us. So that people with disability are included in all things that impact and affect them, and others in society. So it's about involving lived experience.
Hannah, what would you like to see change in the way we think and talk about disability in law and policy in Australia?
I'd like to see us actually think and talk about it. I think that would be a really great start, because, as I said, there's so many situations where it's just not dealt with. I mean, so I mentioned the pandemic plan, which was drafted 5 years before the pandemic, that just didn't mention disability at all. The many times politicians will, it was quite unusual in this federal election to have politicians discussing disability. Normally it's just not talked about. Like we all, like diversity includes disability. If you want to talk about diversity, you have to talk about us. And at the moment, that's not the case. And that includes in the law, that includes in policy. I think also we need to stop assuming that good things are happening, and stop giving people the benefit of the doubt. At the moment, we rely a lot on what we call soft law, and that create self-regulation. And that really gives the benefit of the doubt to people that it's in their interests not to respect people's rights if they don't have to. So just a really simple example, many jurisdictions in Australia don't actually have laws. They have soft law. They don't have laws regulating restrictive practices. So you can actually like tie people up, lock them in their rooms, inject them with drugs against their will. And we just assume that they're doing that for the right reasons. And so, you know, the stuff we're talking about is really, really basic stuff. Like, you know, I think people need to know that these things are happening and they're not regulated by the law.
Neha, what would you like to see change?
I think, as Liz mentioned, and just adding to that, is change in language and how, because framing is really important, and that makes a huge difference in the long run as well. Moving away from the medical model of disability, looking at and embracing a bit more of the social model of disability, adhering to the UN CRPD standards, making sure that any attitudinal, physical, communicational, societal barriers, those are the ones that address, and putting the onus back and looking at making things more inclusive and accessible and respectful. As well as, I think, often when people with disability are being discussed, the whole term of vulnerable is also discussed. I think kind of moving away from it is very important as well. So I think language and how we speak about disability rights, all of this is key and vital, I think. Yeah, thanks.
And Alice, what would you like to see changed?
Much of the same that folks have already said. I think a key thing is moving, as Neha was saying, away from that vulnerability kind of language, or I would say like compassion language. This isn't about compassion. This is about rights. People have a right. And it's sort of inarguable, and it stops there. And just was reflecting on what Hannah was saying in terms of how in the US, a Bill of Rights, and in Australia, a Charter of Rights would focus the minds of the judiciary on rights of people with disability. Would add to that, the beauty of a charter is that ideally you don't even get to the courts, because the government and all of the people making decisions that affect people with disability in the government have the rights of people with disability front and centre of their minds when they're making those decisions.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful, the framing of inalienable human rights that every human being has, as opposed to a whole lot of people feeling sorry for people, which is really not power at all, is it? Last question, I'm just going to come to all of you, and so this will be your last chance to tell the audience what you think. And my final question is, what do you think would be the most powerful tool for upholding or uplifting the rights of people with disability? Liz, what's the most powerful tool?
It's a human rights charter that reflects the human rights of children and young people and all people with disability, but children and young people under the Convention of the Rights of People with Disability and the Convention of the Rights of the Child. So that's a national human rights charter.
Wonderful. Hannah, what do you think?
Oh, I think human rights charter would be pretty good. I think that access to advocacy and justice is really important, because at the moment it's very difficult to actually get anything done and advocate. Yeah.
Neha?
Just as whatever the rest of them mentioned, very important, as well as considering the rights, experiences, and outcomes of people with disability, not just in the disability space, but across all areas, agencies, all sectors, and at all levels of work, whether be it with government, private sector, community level, everything. I think is important. Thinking about intersectionality and the interdependence of all human rights and freedoms and the needs of people with disability is important, because often just think about people with disability having one need and just looking at the disability sector itself, but I feel like it's all interdependent. Yeah, and that needs to be considered. Yeah.
People are more complex than that. They don't just fit one box or one. Yeah,
exactly. That intersectionality always misses out. And thank you.
And last but not least, Alice, you can have the final word. And I think I can guess what you're going to say, but what would be the most powerful tool for upholding the rights of people with disability?
What could it be? What might I think? No, definitely a Charter of Rights for sure. Absolutely. And that would also achieve what Neha was speaking to around intersectionality as well. We need a Charter of Rights that really covers the field and covers lots of different experiences of people. And on that, I'm just going to give one last shameless plug to folks to check out the charterofrights.org.au website to find out more about the campaign for a charter and how to get involved.
Thank you, everyone. And please do check out that website, everyone who's been on the webinar today. Also, anyone who's registered for this webinar will receive the link, and feel free to share the link far and wide. This session's recorded, so please share it with your networks. Thank you again for joining us. Thank you again to our esteemed panelists, who were all really wonderful. And we'll see you again next time. Cheers.